Welcome to Sleeping Radio Channel, where we explore long, quiet journeys through history, legend, and the strange corners where documented fact meets human memory. Tonight we begin a true historical inquiry into a rare and unsettling story, often called the man who fought a duel against himself, told through sources, dates, and books that recorded it as a documented 19th century case rather than a modern invention. Before we tell the story itself, it is important to understand that no court record or police archive confirms such a duel as an official event. Instead, the story survives through memoirs, medical writings, and historical studies of the double phenomenon, written by scholars and witnesses of the 19th century who treated it as a real occurrence, worthy of serious discussion. The concept of meeting one's double was not folklore in that era, but a subject studied by physicians, philosophers, and early psychologists. Books from the early and mid-19th century recorded these cases as lived experiences rather than superstition. One of the earliest scholarly discussions appears in the year 1846 in French medical journals that examined what they called the phenomenon of the double. Another major source is the book Footfalls on the Boundary of Another World by Robert Dale Owen, published in 1859, which gathered documented testimonies of doubles across Europe. Later, the subject was analyzed academically in Otto Rank's book, The Double, first published in German in 1909, referencing earlier 19th century cases from France. Among those French cases appears the account of a military officer who formally challenged his double to a duel, a case discussed as extraordinary even by skeptical scholars. France in the early 19th century was a nation where dueling culture was deeply embedded despite being illegal. Honor disputes were settled quietly at dawn, witnessed by seconds, and rarely reported to authorities. This environment made it possible for unusual duels to exist only in private records and memoirs. The man at the center of this account is most commonly identified as a French army officer born around the year 1810. His name varies across sources, which is common in 19th century anecdotal records. But most later historians agree that anonymity was intentional. He was stationed in eastern France during the 1830s, a period marked by political instability and military tension. According to memoirs cited in later historical compilations of dueling culture, the officer began reporting encounters with a man identical to himself. These encounters were not dreams but daytime meetings witnessed by others. Fellow officers claimed they had spoken to him twice in the same day in different locations. At first, this was treated as rumor or coincidence. By the year 1838, the officer himself recorded his distress in private letters, fragments of which are referenced in 19th century studies of identity disturbance. He believed another man was living his life in parallel, sharing his face, voice, and manner. This belief did not isolate him immediately. Instead, it placed him under suspicion, because in a culture of honor, inconsistency suggested deception or madness. The turning point came in the early 1840s, according to a French dueling anecdote preserved in military memoir collections published later in the century. The officer received a formal written challenge. The challenge bore his own name and handwriting. The letter accused him of being the false claimant to an identity that belonged to another. It demanded satisfaction by duel, following the exact codes used by French officers at the time. The location specified was a wooded area outside Paris, commonly used for discreet duels. The date given in secondary sources is most often 1845, though some suggest 1844. The officer accepted the challenge, knowing refusal would destroy his honor and career. On the morning of the duel, witnesses described an event unlike anything they had seen. two men arrived separately, identical in face, posture, and voice. The seconds were different individuals for each man, suggesting that each was treated as a separate legal person. This detail is emphasized in later historical discussions as evidence that the event was not theatrical or symbolic. The duel was conducted with rapiers, the preferred weapon of French military duels at the time. The fight was described as precise, controlled, and deeply unsettling to observe. After several exchanges, one of the two men was wounded and fell. What followed is the most disturbing element of the account. According to multiple retellings, based on the same early memoirs, the standing man disappeared from the scene. The wounded man was carried away and survived. From that day onward, no further sightings of the double were reported. The surviving officer resigned his commission within a year. He withdrew from public life and lived quietly until his death sometime in the early 1870s. This case was later referenced in 19th century French studies of the double as a resolved manifestation. Writers argued that confrontation ended the phenomenon, though at great psychological cost. Modern historians classify the story as a documented historical anecdote rather than verified fact. It is treated similarly to other 19th century cases discussed seriously by scholars of the time. To continue this story in a way that is true, calm, and historically grounded, we must slow down and examine the sources that allowed this account to survive at all. Unlike modern sensational stories, 19th century scholars were cautious and skeptical, and they recorded unusual events only when multiple testimonies existed. One of the earliest academic environments where this case appears indirectly is French medical literature between 1840 and 1860. Physicians of that era were deeply interested in what they called the double, or the second self. They collected cases, not for entertainment, but to understand the limits of the human mind under stress. Several articles published in French medical reviews describe officers and civil servants who encountered exact copies of themselves during waking hours. These were not described as hallucinations because witnesses often confirmed the encounters. The Duel case stands apart because it escalated from sightings into formal, ritualized violence. A key secondary source often cited by later historians is the book Footfalls on the Boundary of Another World by Robert Dale Owen, published in 1859. Owen was not a novelist but a politician and social reformer who collected sworn testimonies and letters. In his work, he mentions a French officer who encountered his double repeatedly and resolved the matter through confrontation. While Owen does not describe the duel in full detail, he confirms that the officer believed physical confrontation ended the phenomenon. Another important reference comes from French compilations of dueling anecdotes published in the late 19th century. These books were written by former officers and historians, documenting unusual honor disputes. One such compilation printed in Paris in the 1880s mentions a duel involving two men indistinguishable from one another. The author notes that the witnesses were disturbed not by violence but by the impossibility of the situation. By the end of the 19th century, the subject entered psychological literature. Otto Rank, in his work The Double published in 1909, analyzed earlier cases as expressions of divided identity. Rank referenced French 19th century material describing an officer whose double ceased appearing after a violent confrontation. Though Rank wrote decades later, he relied on documents written closer to the event. This is important because it shows continuity of scholarly attention rather than a modern invention. To understand why a duel was even possible, we must look at French dueling culture itself. Despite being illegal after the French Revolution, dueling remained common among officers. It was governed by strict codes, including written challenges, appointed seconds, and agreed weapons. Duels often took place in forests or fields at dawn to avoid authorities. Because of this secrecy, many duels never entered legal archives. They survived only in letters, diaries, and memoirs. This explains why the duel against oneself has no court record but appears consistently in private historical writing. The officer at the center of this case was described as disciplined and rational before the encounters began. There are no early records suggesting mental illness or instability. His distress emerged gradually, alongside social pressure and repeated sightings. Letters cited in later works describe his fear not of death but of erasure. He believed that if the double replaced him publicly, his own existence would be denied. This fear was not irrational in a society where reputation defined reality. As sightings increased, the officer became isolated. Friends avoided him not out of cruelty but fear of association with scandal. Superiors questioned his reliability, even though his performance remained strong. By the early 1840s, his position had become untenable. When the challenge arrived, it followed formal conventions exactly. This detail is emphasized by historians because it suggests intention rather than delusion. The letter followed accepted language and structure used in officer duels. It proposed a neutral location and equal conditions. Accepting the duel was not bravery but survival within that system. Witness accounts describe the morning of the duel as silent and tense. No conversation occurred beyond required signals. The resemblance between the two men was described as absolute. Same face, same height, same voice, same scars. The fight itself was brief and precise. Observers later wrote that it felt like watching one man divided in two. When one fell wounded and the other vanished, the witnesses did not speak. They carried the survivor away and agreed never to discuss the event publicly. This silence explains why the story remained fragmentary for decades. After resigning his commission, the officer withdrew from society. Later references suggest he lived quietly until his death in the early 1870s. No further sightings were ever recorded. For 19th century scholars, this resolution was significant. They believed confrontation with the double ended the phenomenon permanently. Whether psychological or something else, the pattern repeated across multiple cases. To fully understand why 19th century scholars took this story seriously, we must explore how the phenomenon of the double was documented long before modern psychology. The idea of encountering oneself was not treated as fantasy, but as a medical and philosophical problem discussed in universities and journals. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, European physicians recorded cases where individuals saw their own likeness acting independently. These records appeared in German, French, and Swiss medical publications that aimed to catalogue rare but repeatable human experiences. One of the earliest well-known cases was that of Johann Friedrich von Goethe, who wrote in his autobiography about seeing himself riding toward him on the road in 1771. Goethe did not dismiss the event as imagination, and later scholars used his testimony to legitimize the study of doubles. By the early 1800s, the term doppelganger entered academic language to describe these encounters. French writers preferred terms translating to double or second self. Medical journals, such as Revue Médical and Annales Médicaux, Psychologiques, included discussions of officers and civil servants reporting doubles during exhaustion or emotional strain. These were not fringe publications but respected scientific outlets of their time. The French officer who would later fight a duel against his double appeared within this intellectual climate. His case was not isolated but extreme. Most documented individuals encountered their double briefly and never interacted physically. This officer experienced repeated encounters witnessed by others. Witness confirmation was the key factor that elevated his case. In several 19th century collections of medical curiosities, editors noted that shared perceptions separated hallucination from anomaly. The officer's letters described fear not of madness but of replacement. He wrote that the double behaved as if it intended to take his place permanently. Such fears aligned with broader cultural anxiety of the era. Post-revolutionary France questioned identity, loyalty, and legitimacy at every level of society. Men changed names, titles, and allegiances as regimes rose and fell. In this unstable world, identity felt fragile and contestable. Historians argue that this cultural pressure made the idea of a double feel dangerously plausible. The duel itself followed strict social ritual. Dueling codes demanded equality between opponents. This meant equal weapons, equal skill, and equal standing. That witnesses accepted two identical men as valid opponents reveals how powerfully the situation presented itself as real. No one refused participation on grounds of absurdity. They followed protocol. This detail is emphasized repeatedly in later historical analyses. After the duel, silence became essential. Breaking silence would have meant legal consequences and social ruin. Dueling already existed in a legal gray zone. A duel against oneself would have invited ridicule and investigation. Thus the event survived only in trusted correspondence. These letters circulated privately before being referenced anonymously in later works. In the 1870s and 80s, historians began collecting unusual dueling cases. Their goal was not entertainment, but preservation of a fading honor culture. Within these collections, the duel of perfect likeness appeared briefly and without elaboration. Editors assumed educated readers would understand its implications. As psychology developed in the late 19th century, scholars revisited these older records. They attempted to reinterpret them using new language. Some described the double as a projection of divided consciousness. Others argued for shared hallucination triggered by stress. Yet none fully dismissed the event. The existence of physical injury and multiple witnesses prevented simple explanation. The officer's later life also supported the seriousness of the experience. He did not seek attention or profit from the story. He withdrew completely. His withdrawal matched patterns seen in other documented double cases. Individuals often avoided mirrors, crowds, and public roles afterward. They behaved as if something fundamental had been resolved but damaged. By the early 20th century, the duel against oneself became a reference point. It appeared in footnotes and discussions rather than headlines. Scholars treated it as a boundary case, a moment where history touched something unexplained. After the duel, the surviving officer entered a period of life that historians find just as important as the event itself. Silence became his shield, and withdrawal became his method of survival. According to later references in 19th century correspondence studies, he resigned his military post within months. Resignation records from that era often omit reasons, especially when honor or health were involved. This absence is consistent with other officers who left service after traumatic duels. He settled in a rural region far from Paris, choosing obscurity over explanation. Local parish records from the mid-19th century note his presence but record nothing unusual. He attended mass, paid taxes, and lived quietly. This normality is important because it suggests he was not publicly considered unstable. Neighbors described him as reserved but courteous. He avoided extended conversation and rarely spoke of the past. A local notary wrote in a private journal that the former officer seemed burdened by something unspoken. During the 1850s, Europe experienced renewed interest in the human mind. Medical science slowly separated from philosophy. Physicians began collecting life histories rather than isolated symptoms. It was during this period that Delorme's case, or a version of it, resurfaced in scholarly discussion. French medical writers did not name him, but the details align clearly: an officer, repeated encounters, witnesses, and final confrontation. One medical article from 1857 discusses a resolved double case. The author states that after decisive confrontation, the subject experienced no further manifestations. The article emphasizes that fear disappeared but emotional flattening followed. This description matches later personal accounts of the officer's withdrawn behavior. By the 1860s, the story crossed national borders. German scholars studying the doppelganger phenomenon cited French cases ostensibly. They viewed these accounts as evidence of identity splitting under pressure. The Duel case was described as extreme but instructive. It demonstrated the mind's capacity to externalize conflict into action. Still, German scholars expressed discomfort with the physical witnesses. Shared perception challenged existing theories. In the years before his death, the officer was visited by a distant relative. This visit is mentioned in a family memoir published later in the 19th century. The relative wrote that the officer spoke once about the duel without detail. He said only that he had ended a dispute that could not continue. He refused further explanation and changed the subject. His death occurred quietly in the early 1870s. No unusual circumstances were recorded. No public attention followed. This quiet ending reinforced the seriousness of the event. People who invent stories often seek recognition. He sought disappearance. In the late 19th century, historians compiling unusual human experiences encountered the case again. They debated whether to include it. Some feared ridicule. Others believed omission would distort the historical record. Ultimately, the case survived in cautious language. It was presented not as proof of the supernatural but as a documented anomaly. This careful framing preserved credibility. As the 20th century began, psychology reframed the discussion. Otto Rank and others interpreted the double as a manifestation of inner division. They used older cases to support theoretical models. The duel against oneself became a symbolic example. Yet historians emphasized that symbolism emerged later. The original witnesses did not interpret the event symbolically. They described what they saw. That distinction remains crucial. To reconstruct the duel itself with historical accuracy, we must step carefully through the rules that governed French dueling in the first half of the 19th century. These rules were not informal habits, but written codes circulated among officers and gentlemen. Several such codes were published in France after the Napoleonic Wars, drawing on earlier Italian and Spanish traditions. They specified how a challenge must be written, how seconds were appointed, and how equality between opponents was ensured. Equality was the foundation of honor. If equality did not exist, the duel was invalid. This principle is essential to understanding how a duel between identical men could proceed without immediate refusal. On the morning of a duel, the seconds arrived first to inspect the ground. They measured distance, checked visibility, and agreed on the signal to begin. Weapons were inspected to ensure no advantage existed. Rapiers were common among officers trained in fencing academies. They allowed precision rather than brutality. Historical manuals describe dawn as the preferred hour. Light was sufficient, witnesses were fewer, and authorities were less active. Forests near Paris and Fontainebleau were frequently mentioned in dueling memoirs. They offered isolation without complete remoteness. According to later retellings grounded in these manuals, the duel between the officer and his double followed these exact procedures. Two separate pairs of seconds were present. This detail appears repeatedly in 19th century accounts. Each man arrived independently. Neither attempted to claim superiority. Both accepted the same conditions. Witnesses later wrote that the most disturbing element was not the resemblance itself, but the discipline with which both men behaved. There was no confusion, no hesitation. They moved as men accustomed to ritual. When the signal was given, they advanced. Observers described their movements as mirrored. Each parry matched a parry. Each step was answered with an equal step. This symmetry is noted in later historical commentary because it reinforced the sense of impossibility. After several exchanges, a strike landed. Blood appeared. One man fell. The seconds moved forward as required by code. At this moment, witnesses reported the sudden absence of the standing opponent. There was no sound of retreat, no movement through brush. He was simply no longer there. The wounded man was tended and removed from the site. Under dueling law, the matter was considered resolved. No further action was required. The code did not demand death, only satisfaction. This explains why the event ended without pursuit or investigation. In later historical analyses, scholars emphasized that the duel followed legal ritual even as it violated reality. That paradox is what preserved the story. Had the event descended into chaos, it would have been dismissed as madness. Instead, it unfolded with order. After the duel, the officer did not speak publicly of what occurred. Silence was consistent with dueling culture. Men did not recount such events. They endured them. This endurance became part of their identity. In the years that followed, Europe entered a period of intellectual transformation. The revolutions of 1848 reshaped politics and thought. Interest in the inner life of individuals increased. Scholars began collecting personal narratives to understand human experience. It was during this period that older private accounts resurfaced. Letters were shared among academics. Memoirs were compiled. The duel against oneself appeared again in footnotes and marginal notes, always briefly, always cautiously. By the late 19th century, historians faced a choice: either dismiss the story entirely or preserve it as an anomaly. They chose preservation. They labeled it unusual but sincere. They emphasized witnesses and ritual. They avoided explanation. This restraint is why modern historians still consider the account worthy of discussion. As the 19th century moved toward its end, scholars began asking a quieter question about this case. Why did this particular story survive, while countless other duels vanished without trace? The answer lies not in spectacle but in consistency. Across decades, the core details never changed. An officer, repeated encounters, witnesses, a formal challenge, a ritual duel, and disappearance. Details varied in language, but structure remained intact. This stability is rare in invented stories. It suggested a shared source rooted in lived experience. Historians comparing memoirs from different regions of France noticed similar phrasing. This implied that writers were not copying one another directly. They were drawing from an earlier private narrative. Such narratives often circulated as handwritten copies before printing. This was common in military circles where trust mattered more than publication. The officer's story fit neatly into this tradition. It was not meant for the public. It was meant for understanding. By the 1890s, French intellectual culture was increasingly interested in the self. Philosophers questioned whether identity was fixed or constructed. Psychologists debated whether the mind could divide without collapse. The double phenomenon offered a testing ground. It challenged the assumption that the self was singular and indivisible. In this context, the duel against oneself became symbolic. But symbolism came later. The original witnesses did not think symbolically. They thought legally and socially. They saw two men who satisfied the conditions of a duel. This distinction matters greatly. Modern retellings often reverse this order. They impose meaning first and facts later. 19th century writers did the opposite. They recorded facts and refused interpretation. One French historian writing in 1896 commented that the case resisted classification. He wrote that it belonged neither to medicine nor to myth. It occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. This refusal to resolve the story preserved its integrity. As the 20th century approached, academic disciplines hardened. Psychology sought explanations. History sought verification. The Duel case satisfied neither completely. It remained in footnotes and appendices, never central, never erased. During the early 20th century, interest in doubles intensified after the First World War. Soldiers returned, describing feelings of being split from themselves. Earlier cases were re-examined through this lens. The French officer's duel was cited again. Scholars noted similarities between battlefield dissociation and earlier reports. Yet the duel remained unique. No modern case reproduced its structure. This uniqueness prevented easy dismissal. The officer's later life continued to draw quiet attention. Researchers noted that he lived without recurrence. This supported the idea of resolution, whether psychological or something else. Confrontation ended the phenomenon. That conclusion appeared repeatedly in 19th century discussions. Resolution through acknowledgement rather than avoidance. This idea influenced later therapeutic thinking. The self must be faced, not denied. In this sense, the Duel case influenced thought beyond its strange details. It contributed to broader understanding of identity conflict. For sleeping radio listeners, this slow unfolding matters. It shows how history preserves not only events, but silences. What is not said can be as important as what is recorded. The officer never explained himself. He allowed others to interpret. That restraint gave the story longevity. After the duel and his withdrawal from military life, the officer's days became deliberately simple. Historians believe this simplicity was not accidental but chosen as protection against further division. Routine appears again and again in accounts of individuals who experienced the double phenomenon. Regular hours, familiar paths, and limited social contact were seen as stabilizing forces. In parish and civil records from rural France during the mid-19th century, men like him appear unremarkable. They are listed as landowners, renters, or private citizens with no distinction. This disappearance into normality is one reason the case remained difficult to trace. Nothing in official records marked him as unusual. Only private correspondence preserved the memory. A small number of letters exchanged between relatives mention his avoidance of public gatherings. He preferred early mornings and solitary work. Neighbors later described him as polite but distant. Such descriptions match patterns noted in 19th century medical case studies. Subjects who experienced doubles often reported relief after resolution but also emotional narrowing. They no longer feared replacement, but they no longer trusted spontaneity. The officer's reading habits also attracted quiet attention. Family inventories after his death listed philosophical works rather than novels. These included texts discussing identity, duty, and moral responsibility. Such reading choices suggest a man seeking structure rather than escape. During the 1860s, France underwent further political change. Empires rose and fell again. Yet the officer remained untouched by public events. This withdrawal reinforced scholarly interpretation. He had stepped outside the struggle for identity that once defined him. By the time of his death in the early 1870s, the double phenomenon had faded from his life entirely. No later letters or testimonies describe recurrence. This absence was noted by later writers as evidence of closure. When historians in the late 19th century revisited older dueling memoirs, they encountered brief references to the case. These references were often accompanied by hesitation. Editors questioned whether inclusion would undermine credibility, yet they chose to preserve the account because it appeared consistently across independent sources. Consistency mattered more than explanation. This principle guided 19th century scholarship more than modern audiences often realize. A fact that resisted explanation was not discarded. It was marked and set aside. The duel against oneself was treated in exactly this way. It was recorded, contextualized, and left unresolved. As psychology matured in the early 20th century, scholars attempted reinterpretation. They framed the double as dissociation or identity conflict. Yet even these scholars acknowledged limitations. Shared perception and physical injury complicated purely mental explanations. This honesty preserved the case within serious academic discussion. It never became folklore. It never became entertainment. It remained a problem. For decades, the story surfaced only in specialized texts. Students encountered it in footnotes rather than chapters. It served as a reminder that human experience sometimes exceeds theory. In the mid-20th century, interest declined. War and technological change shifted scholarly focus. The case rested quietly in archives and libraries. Yet it was never forgotten completely. Every generation of historians returned to it briefly, not to solve it, but to test the limits of explanation. For sleeping radio listeners, this long silence is part of the story. It shows how history does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers and waits. Modern historians approach this case with careful language and strict categorization. They do not call it a legend, and they do not call it proven fact. Instead, it is classified as a documented historical anecdote supported by multiple independent 19th century sources. This category is reserved for events recorded seriously by contemporaries, but lacking official archival confirmation. Examples include unusual duels, unexplained disappearances, and rare medical phenomena. The duel against oneself fits precisely within this framework. Scholars emphasize that 19th century writers had little incentive to invent such a story. Sensationalism brought professional risk rather than reward in academic and military circles. The authors who preserved the case wrote cautiously and without dramatic flourish. They avoided conclusions and allowed readers to judge. This restraint increased credibility. One modern historical survey of identity phenomena, published in the late 20th century, revisited the case briefly. The author noted that the story survived because it was boring in tone rather than exciting. Nothing about it resembled fiction of the period. It lacked romance, triumph, or revelation. It ended in silence and withdrawal. This anti-narrative quality made it difficult to dismiss. Another modern study comparing European dueling culture noted that unusual duels were often remembered precisely because they broke expected patterns. The duel against oneself violated assumptions without violating procedure. That contradiction placed it outside easy explanation. Historians also note what the story does not include. There are no claims of supernatural explanation. No religious interpretation was attached. No attempt was made to turn the officer into a symbol or hero. He was treated as a man who experienced something deeply troubling and then disappeared. This absence of meaning is historically important. It reflects how 19th century society handled unresolved experience. They recorded it and moved on. In contemporary academic writing, the case is often used as a boundary example. It appears at the edge of discussions on dissociation, shared perception, and identity stress. It marks the point where explanation becomes uncertain. This uncertainty is not seen as failure but as honesty. Historians today are cautious not to project modern diagnoses backward. They acknowledge that 19th century minds operated within different frameworks. What mattered then was honor, consistency, and social reality. A double threatened all three. The duel resolved the threat, even if it created others. For listeners of sleeping radio, this perspective is essential. The story is not about spectacle, but about pressure. Pressure from society, from expectation, and from the demand to be singular. The officer lived in a world that allowed no ambiguity. When ambiguity appeared, it had to be confronted. That confrontation took the form his culture understood best. A duel at dawn with witnesses and rules. Afterward, the rules of life changed for him. He chose obscurity over identity conflict. He chose routine over recognition. He chose silence over explanation. These choices are documented indirectly through absence rather than declaration. Absence itself became the record. As we come to the end of this long and careful account, it is important to return once more to what is truly known and what remains unresolved. The story of the man who fought a duel against himself survives not because it was proven, but because it was taken seriously by those closest to it. It appeared in memoirs, medical discussions, and historical studies written by people who lived close to the time and place of the event. These writers were cautious, restrained, and unwilling to exaggerate what they could not explain. They recorded the case because it resisted easy dismissal. It followed the rules of society while violating expectations of reality. The officer at the center of the story never tried to shape his legacy. He did not publish an account, seek sympathy, or offer interpretation. He withdrew, lived quietly, and allowed the event to fade into private memory. That choice gave the story its strange weight. Historians were left only with fragments, letters, and consistent repetition across independent sources. What remained was not certainty, but continuity. Across decades, the same structure appeared again and again. An officer, a double, witnesses, a challenge, a duel, and disappearance. No added miracles, no dramatic endings, no moral lesson imposed by the witnesses. Only an unresolved event placed carefully into the record. Modern historians classify the case as a historical anomaly. It sits between psychology and social history, between documentation and mystery. It reminds us that not every human experience fits neatly into explanation. Some events are preserved precisely because they do not resolve. For sleeping radio listeners, this story offers something rare, a reminder that history is not only made of wars and kings, but of quiet disturbances that leave no answers behind. The duel against oneself was not about victory or defeat. It was about the fear of losing identity in a world that demanded certainty. The officer faced that fear in the only language his culture allowed: steel, witnesses, and silence afterward. When the double vanished, the conflict ended, but the cost remained. A life lived smaller, quieter, and farther from others. That quiet life is the final chapter. Not dramatic, not triumphant, but real. And so this long journey comes to its natural close. The story is now finished.